Human trafficking is not just a distant overseas problem. The issue is here. It's in our communities. It's in our small towns. It's in our big cities.
In the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, a children's hospital that had been officially closed for over a decade was still operational, still using electricity, and still operating underground every night on January 4th, shortly after midnight. The electricity within that facility increased by 480% between 1 a.m. for 8 years in a row, despite the fact that it was no longer there on paper, and 4 a.m., while 1,964 consecutive nights of movement were captured by federal cameras inside a facility without any patients, employees, or inspections. Beneath that stillness, investigators soon discovered a functioning system, a secret tunnel, pediatric organ trays, staged drugs, and records indicating 263 youngsters transferred through special medical referrals, many of whom were never seen again rather than neglect or decay. Chaos and violence were not necessary for this operation to succeed. It was dependent on order. Along with quantities of heroin, meth, and fentanyl ready for export, it was transported from an abandoned hospital to refrigerated containers at a Texas seaport, where 130 children were discovered alive minutes before going missing into international waters. This film shows how drug smuggling, organ harvesting, and people trafficking may take place inside reputable organizations, shielded by routine paperwork and silence rather than secrecy. Subscribe to the channel if you think stories like this should be told, so that more inquiries can be seen by those who are eager to learn more. Before we get started, please let me know in the comments what year you were born and if this story has altered your perspective on the systems you were raised to believe. A children's medical clinic in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas was formally closed more than 10 years prior, just after midnight. After closing due to 17 safety breaches and $48,200,000 days in outstanding medical debt in 2013, the building was no longer a hospital on paper. Therefore, there were no patients, no physicians, no nurses, no staff schedules, and no annual inspections that seemed to have halted time. However, for 8 years in a row, buildings remember how to breathe. Additionally, the facility's electrical use increased by 480% each night. The full surge, which always begins just after 1 in the morning, originates from the basement level, and coming to a conclusion just before 4 a.m. without holidays, without weekends, without exceptions. Later, movement within the building was verified by federal cameras for 1,964 nights in a row, which is longer than most people stay in the same house or the average child spends primary school. At the same time, numerous large-scale drug seizures, including heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl, occurred in the surrounding areas, while nearby arrests turned up Glock 19 handguns, AR-15 style rifles, and AK pattern weaponry. They are all passing through the same hallways at the same times. Additionally, there were the records of kids who were sent under special pediatric referral programs, for which no return paperwork or follow-up reports were ever submitted. This is the question that would not go away. Why is power necessary in the middle of the night in a closed children's hospital? Why does a building that is empty act as though it is alive? And how does a location that has been declared obsolete continue to leave traces? The 480% electrical increase only occurred at night, and never once occurred during daylight hours, indicating that the building was not deteriorating but rather adhering to a timetable. As investigators started lining up the numbers, the pattern stopped looking odd and started to look intentional. The narrative was the same with the backup generators, which burned 3,200 gallons of fuel each month without any breaks, without any seasonal variations, and without any indication of emergency use, something that a vacant building just does not do by accident. Another layer was provided by logistics data, which revealed 12 truck entrances each month via a rear technical access road. These entries were always made after midnight, were never documented, and never matched any lawful delivery schedule associated with a closed medical facility. Administratively, the stillness was equally deafening since, between 2014 and 2024, there were no on-site inspections and 9 operating permits were silently renewed by automated systems that never needed a person to enter the structure. The files were then layered. Children under the age of 7 were classified under overseas pediatric referral in 263 entries. Additionally, 29 cases over a 6-week period were identified in those files as non-survivable transfers, meaning they lacked family contacts and identities, just timestamps, blood type, and body weight. Every executive director approved approval concluded with one line. Every single spike matched a signature when investigators compared those approvals with the electrical surges. This was being run by someone. Nobody knew who, which was the only issue. Thus, ask yourself this. To conceal a pattern, how many permissions are required? How long can data remain silent before pointing to a human hand again? 4:52 a.m. Federal systems enabled the highest authorization level on a covert server before the Rio Grande Valley saw daybreak. Additionally, a complete name showed on the screen for the first time without any explanation or emphasis, reading Ion Farfara Ismail, Executive Director, as though the system had always known who was in command and was now being made to admit it. There was only one line of background information in the profile linked to that access. Nothing else in the file attempted to explain purpose, intent, or physical presence because documentation does not explain behavior. The Somali was born, later naturalized as a U.S. citizen, and administrative authority was kept beyond the hospital closure. It merely keeps track of approval. Within minutes of that confirmation, 147 federal agents began to target the Rio Grande Children's Medical Center, a facility that was officially declared inactive but continued to use fuel and electricity every night, as though it were running on a set schedule. Additionally, the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Federal Bureau of Investigation worked together to carry out the operation using a single command channel, moving through quiet hallways lined with dust, covered gurneys, and faded pediatric signage that had not been updated since the hospital closed more than 10 years earlier. The entry started at the staff access point on the east side of the building, where the Alpha team broke through the doors and secured the first floor. It was eerie to feel as though time had stopped but work had not. Following the electrical load that had increased night after night, the Bravo crew went straight to the basement and came upon a strong steel door that had been welded shut from the inside. It took precisely 92 seconds to cut through a door that was not included in any of the original drawings and could only be explained by recent construction. 5 armed guards tried to retreat behind a concrete barrier with Glock 19 handguns and AK-type rifles, but none of them made it to the tunnel entrance. The gunfire started right after the breach and stopped 27 seconds later. The only sound remaining after the last shot reverberated across the tiled hallway was the constant hum of ventilation fans. Beyond the threshold, the building's function abruptly changed. Subterranean to the hospital, a 312-foot tunnel was reinforced with steel beams and equipped with a contemporary ventilation system that had been installed less than 2 years prior. The tunnel featured bright, temperature-controlled lighting and painted floor markings spaced 10 meters apart, giving the impression that the area was a managed logistics route rather than an abandoned basement. An industrial filtration machine with a capacity of 1,500 L of biological waste per day, far more than any maintenance requirement, was connected to drainage pipes that ran along the walls. Additionally, subsequent examination verified the presence of biological residue on several tunnel surfaces. Agents went inside 3 sealed rooms at the far end of the corridor, in accordance with a controlled staging point as opposed to a bulk shipping destination. The first one comprised 84 kilograms of heroin and fentanyl that were vacuum-packed, labeled, and placed in transport order. There were 117 pediatric-coated organ trays in the second, colder chamber, which was lined with medical-grade freezers. The trays were merely labeled with body weight, blood type, and time. No names, photos, or other personal identifiers other than those needed for transfer were present. There was nobody in the third room. It had only been cleared a few hours prior, according to thermal readings. 3 physicians and 1 surgical technician tried to escape down the tunnel with bags containing bundled cash, encrypted phones, and detachable storage devices, while the basement was being guarded. However, 11 miles south of the hospital, highway enforcement units stopped their car and recovered $1,900,000 in cash, as well as internal documents that describe operations that had never been approved by a reputable medical authority, since every equipment purchase, transfer approval, and record closure could be linked to the same account, permission level, and name. Forensic teams were able to access the subsurface server back inside the building, and the administrative trail was fully closed. The executive director is Ion Farr. No conversations were recorded, no messages were saved, and there was no proof that the account holder had actually visited the hospital that evening. Just a spotless administrative record attesting to the fact that nothing happened by accident, and that nothing moved without permission. The supposedly deserted structure had not been concealing mayhem or despair. Order had been concealed. The hospital was completely secured at 5:15 a.m. Command units were already rerouting resources to a second location, while evidence teams were cataloging narcotics, weapons, organs, and data, because what had been discovered was the operational core of an operation rather than its conclusion. And that raises an interesting topic. How many permits are required before something this well organized starts to feel normal? If a closed children's hospital could operate in this manner without anyone noticing? And how many rulings are made before everyone forgets what the system was designed to safeguard? As daylight broke over the Texas seaport at 5:41 a.m., the information retrieved from the hospital basement indicated 3 refrigerated containers that were already prepared for departure, placed among thousands of others, rather than rooms or tunnels. Cranes proceeded to load steel containers while port operations carried on as though nothing out of the ordinary was happening. Longshore men performed their designated shifts while forklifts traversed designated lanes, unaware of or unwilling to observe that 3 containers had been marked for imminent interception prior to their departure from U.S. waters. After federal leadership approved a full port reaction, lanes were stopped, access roads were secured, and armed squads were deployed in less than 90 seconds. 3 container trucks started their engines and tried to leave the loading zone, but the first one accelerated into a makeshift barricade, bending steel and stalling less than 100 feet from the pier edge. The second truck veered toward a service exit before agents disabled it with controlled fire aimed at the engine block. The third truck continued pushing, setting up a furious chase through congested cargo corridors where visibility was reduced to noise, smoke, and reverberating metal. For 43 seconds, there was gunshots. A third suspect surrendered after being wounded and dropped his weapon next to a forklift, while 2 armed escorts brandishing Glock 19 pistols and AR-15 style rifles opened fire from behind stacked pallets. However, both were destroyed before they could find cover. Designated for use during the night, agents went straight to the containers after securing the perimeter. The first one, which was a mass consignment meant to vanish into international distribution channels, comprised 1,200 kilograms of heroin that had been vacuum sealed, stacked in uniform bricks, and tagged for export. 1,400 kilograms of fentanyl and methamphetamine were stored in the second container, packed with the same accuracy as in legal freight operations and arranged according to chemical density. It was colder in the third container. 130 youngsters were imprisoned, sedated, and alive within. Inside insulated medical crates, each labeled with pediatric codes such as body weight, blood type, and transfer time that corresponded to the hospital records retrieved hours earlier. With the sky changing color, emergency medical professionals rushed in, cutting locks, opening containers, and bringing youngsters out into the open, because every minute was significant at that point. The 3 containers would have cleared the harbor, entered international waters, and disappeared into shipping lanes where no audit warrant or reconstruction could ever recover what was lost on the concrete among shell casings and tire marks. Investigators later confirmed, had the port response been delayed by 10 minutes, agents paused longer than necessary, not out of relief, but in understanding that the seaport was neither the start nor the finish of the system. It was just the final door, and nothing returns once that door closes. Every document, approval, and transaction continued to point back to the same administrative center, so by the time the evidence was presented, the story no longer belonged to a single building or a single night. Ayan Farah Ismail, a 51-year-old Somali native who later obtained U.S. citizenship, was the executive director of a children's medical facility that had formally ceased operations years prior. She did not appear in any of the footage from the seaport or on the arrest logs from the hospital raid, because she was never needed because all of the files related to the operation pointed to a single authorization point, and that authorization existed on paper rather than in loading docks or hallways. 41 shell firms operating in several jurisdictions and transferring a total of $214 million over 7 years, divided into transactions under $250,000 each, were found through financial research. Big enough to keep the system running continuously, but small enough to avoid automated reporting. One county inspector paid $11,400 a month for inspections that never happened, and 17 public officials received recurrent payments under the pretense of consultancy fees. Additionally, 68 refrigerated containers were authorized by one port compliance inspector without a single door being opened. It was more difficult to plan the human cost. 263 kids made it through the system. 130 were found alive. 133 had already been consumed. Because she didn't need to transport anything herself, Ayan Farah Ismail wasn't at the port or inside the hospital. That's what her signature accomplished for her. And it's the part that's still most difficult to accept because the system didn't fail silently. It worked precisely as intended, rewarding acceptance, defending routine, and letting paperwork take the place of accountability. Therefore, how this occurred is not the last question. After everything that was discovered in this case, the question is how many signatures it takes before nobody remembers who the system was meant to protect, since the tunnel, the drugs, or the containers were never the most perilous aspect of this scenario. One reality feels indisputable. However, normal processes continued to function while something fundamentally flawed passed through them unchecked. People's negligence for one night did not lead this to occur. It occurred because routines gradually turned into permission. Paperwork took the place of inquiries, and trust took the place of attention, a trap that any society can slip into if it thinks that buildings, titles, and procedures equate to safety. The lesson here is to stay aware rather than to live in constant terror, since danger does not always come in the form of chaos or violence. Sometimes it appears subtly, disguised as routine tasks, signed documents, and authorized requests that are not challenged. Since awareness is frequently the first and only warning we receive, if this narrative caused you to pause, reflect, or feel uneasy, then it accomplished its goal. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you think stories like these are important. These will allow these investigations to continue reaching more individuals who are ready to investigate further. And I have a quick question for you before you leave. In which year were you born? Does a tale like this alter your perspective on the institutions you were raised to trust? Post your opinions in the comments section,